Hi there, my name's Scott Walker, or you can call me Walks, and I'm a nature photographer. And one of the forms of nature photography I love to do is macro, whether that's insects, flowers, fungi, whatever. Making small things appear big in the photo is what I love to do. And so in this Laowa Macro Masterclass video, I'm going to take you through finding the perfect focal length for your macro whilst I'm out in the woods looking for macro opportunities. So let's get on. So firstly, let's talk about the theory. What difference does focal length make? People often think that as you increase the focal length of your lens, you zoom in. And it can feel like this, particularly if you're used to wildlife, landscapes, or portrait photography. But this really isn't the case. What you're actually doing is changing the angle of view. And the angle of view is how wide of a scene your lens can project onto your sensor. In macro photography, there are two classic focal length ranges that are very popular. So firstly, the 90mm to 100mm range, and this gives you a fairly narrow angle of view. Then you get the 50mm to 60mm range, and this gives you a slightly wider angle of view. It's quite popular because people feel that 50mm is about the same angle of view you get when you view things through your own eyes. But there are other types of lenses that give you different angles of view. So for example, today I will also be using a wide angle lens, and this gives you a much wider scene that you're capturing. So the main thing to understand is that the focal length changes how much of the background you can capture in your image. So now, the gear that I'm going to be using today, I've got 4 different Laowa lenses with me. So firstly, I have got the 58mm, so that's the middle range one that's in that sort of 50 to 60mm range. I've got my 90mm, and both the 58 and 90mm are ultra macro lenses that go to 2 times magnification. I've also got the 15mm f4 wide angle lens, and that goes up to 1:1 magnification. And then finally, I've got the 25mm, and this goes from 2.5 times magnification to 5 times magnification. So we've got 4 different focal lengths and a variety of reproduction ratios. So I'm going to go into those and give you some examples. So let's start off with a couple of classic macro shots. I'm going to look for some spiders. I know there are some here on this holly bush. And for this kind of thing, we want a nice clear background. So typically the spider will be in its web or hanging from one of the leaves, and you want a decent distance to the background. Now, in this case, it doesn't really matter whether you go for something in the sort of 60mm range or the 90 to 100mm range, because we want to get fairly close to the subject, but we don't need an awful lot in the background. So those wide angle focal lengths aren't really going to help us in this case. So I'm going to show you this with 2 different photos that I'll get, one using the 58mm and one using the 90mm. And you probably won't be able to see a lot of difference between the two. So I've got the Quangren Twin Macro Flash on, which is also available from Laowa, and I'm going to work around and see if I can find some spiders. So firstly, we've got a mesh weaver spider hanging in its web, and this was shot with the 58mm lens. Nice and sharp on the eyes, clear background, a classic kind of macro shot. And next we move on to what I think was a pink prowler hanging underneath one of those holly leaves, and this was shot with the 90mm lens. Now, if we compare those 2 photos, you can't really tell that one was shot with a 58mm and one was shot with a 90mm. So why is that? So firstly, both photos were shot at a 1:1 reproduction ratio, or what we often call magnification. And 1:1 is 1:1 regardless of what the focal length is. As we learnt earlier, the focal length is about the angle of view. But because you've got nothing in the background of these photos, they were both fairly clear, you've got no frame of reference to understand that one was a slightly wider picture than the other. So, does focal length make a difference at all? Okay, so I found a fairly small mushroom just here. Hopefully you can see it on the camera, but it's quite small. It's about maybe 1.2, 1.3 centimetres across, a little bit bigger than a centimetre. So it's perfect for a 1-to-1 reproduction ratio, or what we commonly call magnification. And with something like this, you could go for any of the focal lengths, but you'll end up with quite different results. So with the 90mm, I could go for isolating the subject and not having much else in the photo. That can be quite nice, but in this light, I don't think it's going to be particularly interesting. My other option would be to go for a little bit wider and use the 58mm. Now, in this circumstance, I could dress the scene, I could put a few things around it and make a tiny little scene for that mushroom and take all of that in. That would be quite good. The other option would be to go for a wide angle and take in quite a wide expanse of the woodland around this. But I don't think that's going to work in this particular circumstance because the woodland here isn't particularly photogenic. But I'll take all three photos so that you can see a comparison of what you get at those different focal lengths. So first, the 90mm shot. I've gone for a really close-in shot here at 1.25:1 magnification. Perhaps this is a little bit boring with a mushroom, but you can see all that texture and detail at the front of it. 90mm is an ideal focal length for getting portrait shots of insects or perhaps focusing on parts of flowers. This is the kind of shot where the background isn't so important, so you're not telling a story here so much as you are showing off the details of something. Moving on, next I dress the scene by setting up a fern leaf and putting a pine cone in the background in readiness for putting the 58mm lens on. With this 58mm shot, I've gone for a little bit under 1-to-1 magnification to allow me to get a little bit wider view and take in those things that I've dressed the scene with. And 58mm is great for this. If you don't need a lot of background in, but you need something, you need that little bit more, this is the ideal kind of focal length for that. Anything in the 50 to 60mm range you can do some really nice things with. And then moving on to the wide angle shot, the 15mm. Here I've taken in quite a lot of the forest background, but it is a little bit messy. And one of the things that you need to be aware of with a 15mm is that you are going to have to think about your background quite a lot more and think perhaps a little bit like a landscape photographer does in the way that you compose your image. So in this case, the 58mm is probably my favourite option for this particular subject. So I've come to this lovely part of the woodland with big tall pine trees, and behind me you can see a bed of moss across the woodland floor. And so this is the kind of place where the wide angle lens comes into its own, because this is where you can capture a lot of background behind your subject and show off the environment that it's in. And that's what the wide angle gives you. It gives you the opportunity to put your subject in the context of its environment. So I'm going to go off, hopefully might find a mushroom or two, and I'll show you how I use that wide angle lens. Okay, so I found this little fella here, and this is a mushroom called a stinkhorn. And I can attest it does smell. It's not as bad as the name might make out, but it does give off a pungent aroma, and that attracts flies. It's also oozing this goo, which the flies will lap up, and that is then how the mushroom spreads its spores. But this mushroom is much too big for 1-to-1 magnification macro, so I'm still going to use my wide-angle macro lens, but I'll come out a little bit and be at less than 1-to-1 magnification and give you a view of the forest background. And then, hopefully, I'll be able to get in a bit closer and get some of these really tiny little flies. They're not big flies. They're not as big as a housefly, for example. But if I can get relatively close to them, hopefully I can get some 1-to-1 magnification shots. Now, one thing I would say about this macro lens, and one of the best ways to make use of it in an environment like this, is to use its shift function. So you may be familiar with tilt-shift lenses, and this has got the shift element of it. So there's a little lever at the side that allows you to move the lens up and down, and the purpose of that is to correct the straightness of things that are in the background, like trees, because without it you would be getting close to that kind of fisheye effect where the trees are leaning inwards. So this is a really useful function of that lens. So just to demonstrate how that shift function works, you can see here the trees at the edge are leaning in slightly. So now if I lift that lever and just shift the lens up a little bit and reposition it, then we get nice straight trees. So that's what that shift function does for you. So here's a photo with a reproduction ratio of 1:10. So not macro photography, but close-up or near macro photography. And although this isn't macro, it gives you a real feeling for what this wide-angle lens can achieve, showing quite a lot of the forest in the background. And next, I got a little bit closer with a reproduction ratio of about 1:5, so half as close again. And I quite like this shot, even if it's not true macro. In this case, though, I never got to true macro, because when I got close enough to try and get those flies at a 1:1 ratio, I found the lens pressed up right against the mushroom, because the working distance for this type of lens is so close. So I ended up with a blob of that slime from the mushroom all over the front of my lens. So whilst this was a bit of a fail, it does lead me on nicely to the next point about working distances with macro lenses. We macro photographers like to talk about the working distance, and that is the distance from the front element of your lens to the subject that you're focusing on. And lens manufacturers like Laowa talk about another distance, and that's the minimum focusing distance, and that is the distance from your sensor to the thing that you're focusing on. Now, the difference between those two distances is the length of your lens plus something called the flange distance, and that is the distance from the sensor to the flange mounting point of your camera. So why do lens manufacturers quote the minimum focusing distance? It's because that is always the same no matter which camera system you're working with, whereas the working distance changes depending on the flange length of the camera system that you have. But either way, the working distance or minimum focus distance decreases as the focal length decreases. So that means that with shorter focal length lenses, you have a shorter working distance and minimum focusing distance to get 1:1 magnification or reproduction ratio. So for longer focal length lenses like 90 to 100mm, the minimum focusing distance might be something like this. When you reduce that down to 50 to 60mm, you need to get that little bit nearer to your subject to get them at 1:1 magnification. And with a wide-angle lens, you need to get even closer. So, of the 4 lenses I'm using today, the minimum focusing distance for the Laowa 90mm is 20.5 centimetres. For the Laowa 58mm, it's 18.5 centimetres. For the 25mm, which you'll see coming up, it ranges from 17.3 centimetres at 5 times magnification to 23.4 centimetres at 2.5 times magnification. And the Laowa 15mm wide-angle lens has a minimum focusing distance of 12.2 centimetres. But when you account for the lens being 11.1 centimetres, plus a few millimetres for the flange length, 1:1 magnification is gained at just a few millimetres working distance away from the subject. So I've come across this little purple mushroom. It's an amethyst deceiver, and the cap on it is about 1 centimetre. The stem is maybe 2.5 centimetres long, and it's perfect to get a 1:1 macro on this wide angle. But I'm going to do a comparison with the other focal lengths too. So let's just start off by getting a shot at 1:1, and we'll take it from there. So there you can see we've got the mushroom, and there's a nice bit of background there. The mushroom looks big, even though it's tiny, but contrasted against those trees that you can see in the background, in softness, this really makes the mushroom look like it's a mighty part of the forest, but it isn't. And this is the beauty of the wide-angle shot. So now let's get the 58mm on, and we'll do the same thing. So I'm going to set it to 1:1 magnification. I'm going to put it in at about f16, the same. And let's go for 1:1 magnification, the same as before. Now, you'll notice that at 1:1 for this, I'm a lot further away. And I'm at a slightly different angle. So it may appear like the mushroom is slightly bigger in the frame. It isn't. It's just a different angle. If we compare those two shots, I'm sure you'll see the size of the cap is the same. And there we go. So with that one, there's not an awful lot of detail in the background. We can't really tell it's part of a forest. Could be anywhere. Could be your back garden. So now I'm going to frame up a shot with the same size of background and then focus on the mushroom, and we'll see what reproduction ratio we need to get that shot. Okay, so I've had to move maybe about 30 centimetres or a foot back to get approximately the same size background in this shot. And that puts me down at 0.5:1. So I'm actually at half magnification here to get this shot with the same background. So this now isn't macro, it's close-up photography. And it's still quite a nice shot, but it doesn't tell quite the same story as that wide angle did, with the mushroom looking large in the frame. So this here shows the difference that a wide angle macro can make to your macro photography, and particularly with reference to the background. So remember, at 1:1, the subject is always the same size. It's the background where it makes the difference. Now, I'm going to switch over to the 90mm and do the same thing. So here we are with the 90mm shot, and you'll see that the close-up, the 1:1 magnification, very similar to the 58mm, because those subjects are the same size at 1:1 magnification. But now, if I pull back and try and get the same size background, you'll see that the mushroom is even smaller in the frame. I'm at about 0.25:1, so a quarter magnification. And the mushroom looks really tiny here. So here, between those three shots, I hope you can really see the difference that it makes in focal length to the type of photo that you get. And if you're wanting those really close, cropped-in photos, then a longer focal length is better. But if you're wanting to get a lot of background in, but still having the subject at 1:1 magnification, a shorter focal length is better. So now I want to use a slightly different type of lens. This is the Laowa 25mm f2.8 2.5 to 5 times magnification macro lens. And it looks a little bit strange, and it extends really, really far. Look, almost doubles in length. But this allows you to get in really close and get some high resolution images of very tiny things. So in the summer, it's great for photographing parts of insects. You can get in on a butterfly, for example, and get its eye blown up or something like that. In the autumn, it's great for photographing really small funguses. And all year round, it's great for photographing moss and lichen. So some of those individual parts of moss and lichen are so tiny, you would not get anywhere near them with a normal macro lens. But allowing you to go to up to 5 times magnification is fantastic. But let's talk about focal length, because all of these specialist type of lenses tend to have slightly smaller focal lengths than your traditional 90mm, 100mm type macro lenses. And that's for a very good reason. As we learnt earlier, when you have a shorter focal distance, you also have a closer working distance, the distance from your lens to the subject. And so, if you've got one of those longer focal lengths, it means that you have to rock backwards and forwards slightly further. And when you're at such tight magnifications as 5 times, you don't want to be moving big distances to try and get it in focus, because that depth of field is so shallow, even at fairly narrow apertures like f11 or f16. So you want to have a very short working distance so you can rock slightly and get it in focus. And that means these type of lenses need to have a smaller focal length. So I'm going to go off now, see if I can find some really tiny funguses, and we'll get some photos of them. Okay, so I found this bit of broken branch that's on the ground, and it's got these little white funguses growing out of them. I don't quite know what they are, but they're really interesting. One of them has a really tiny water droplet on it, and the water droplet can't even be a millimetre across. I can barely see it with the naked eye. It wasn't until I looked through the lens that I noticed it. But even the widest of these is probably about 3 millimetres in length, these little white stems. Don't know if you can see it on the camera, but I'll try and get a close-up video shot for you. But I'm going to work my way around this little log and see if I can find some interesting photos of them. Now, I've got the twin macro flashback on because when you're focusing in at this kind of magnification, it gets really dark. So even with a fairly wide aperture, it still gets fairly dark. So we've got this pilot light that allows you to focus, and then we've got the twin flashes on. So let me work my way around the log. I'll get some photos of these, and I'll show you the kind of results you can get with a specialist lens like this. Here are a few of those images. This one kind of reminds me of a cartoon's foot. And I quite like this one with that water droplet at the front. But this is my favourite, this little grouping of 3. I really like the shapes, and I particularly like the water drops at the bottom that are reflecting the forest behind them. So you can see more of my content, including macro, wildlife, landscapes and others, over on my main channel, Walks on the Wild Side, here on YouTube. Thank you very much to Laowa for asking me to be part of this macro masterclass series, and thank you for watching. See you next time.